Hey everyone, slow start. Here we go. So this is a lecture on post-war America. Not the Cold War stuff that we're doing in class, but on what was happening in domestic society. So at the end of this, what you should be able to answer is, what are the key characteristics of what America looked like after the war in the late 40s and 50s? Or another way to ask the question is, how was post-war America different from before the war? What were the key ways that society was different? I have four. The first one is affluence. We were much wealthier. The second one is the growth of suburbs. Third would be the importance of the automobile. And the fourth would be the population changes of the baby boom. See that in the picture behind you. Let's start with affluence. I'm going to click on this reading actually. I've used this digital history textbook before, and we'll be using it again this unit. So this is the post-war era right there. It's the overview, and I'm just going to read a little bit to you. I think it's good. 1945, the U.S. was a far different country than it subsequently became. So this is in 45. Nearly a third of Americans lived in poverty. A third of the country's homes had no running water. 2/5 lacked flush toilets. 3/5 lacked central heating. More than half the nation's farm dwellings still had no electricity, even after the New Deal. Most African Americans still lived in the South, where racial segregation in schools and public accommodations was still the law. The number of immigrants was small as a result of the immigration quotas of the 20s. There was no such thing as a shopping mall. Following World War II, the U.S. began an economic boom that brought unparalleled prosperity to a majority of its citizens. This is really when America becomes the country that you and I recognize, where we kind of expect prosperity. And that's what this says next. And raised American expectations, breeding a belief that most economic and social problems could be solved. I'll come back to the other stuff on that reading later. This picture kind of that's an advertisement, but it symbolizes kind of the wealth of goods that Americans had, or many Americans began to get after the war. And it's in sharp contrast to the life in the 30s, even the 20s for many people, although obviously in the 20s people in the cities and the middle class began to afford things. And so this is kind of the age of American prosperity. In 1947, the U.S. had by far the world's most productive economy. We had 6% of the total world population, but we produced half of the world's manufactured goods. So that's probably a statistic to write down. 50% of the world's manufacturing output was produced by the U.S. in 1947. We produced almost 60% of the steel. We produced 62% of world oil and over 80% of the world's cars. That's what I talked about on Monday. We were a dominant industrial economy. The average American earned 15 times as much as the average European. So it's definitely an age of affluence. Here is the original McDonald's west of Chicago, Illinois in the 50s. There are three post-war trends that I just mentioned that could be evident from this photograph. See if you can figure out which three they are. Let's go from affluence to the second topic, which is suburbs. Prior to the late 40s, suburbs weren't really a thing. Around big cities, there were definitely fringe communities, but they weren't a big part of where people lived. For example, Bethlehem was a town back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, but it was just a small town where people lived on farms. And the idea that it was a suburb of Albany only happened after World War II, and that happened all around the country. In 1940, most Americans lived on small farms or in small towns with fewer than 2,000 inhabitants or in big cities. By 2000, 60 years later, most Americans lived in suburbs. 80% of all Americans lived in suburbs. That's a huge shift, kind of like the shift from rural to urban. It all starts with this man, William J. Levitt. 1949, William Levitt opened a sales office for inexpensive single-family homes in a potato field in the center of Long Island's Nassau County. There it is. It was bitterly cold in March, but 1,000 young couples crowded outside the sales office, waiting for its chance to buy a 4-room, 25 by 32-foot house for $7,000. Financed by the government, no money down. So William Levitt was in some ways the originator of the cheap mass-produced housing for the suburbs, and his houses looked like that. His first development was called Levittown. He built one in what became the suburbs of Long Island outside New York City, and another one outside Philadelphia. There's a Levittown, Pennsylvania, too. Small little salt box houses. By today's standards, couldn't fit much, but they were much bigger than the cramped tenement apartments that many of the people left the cities to move to the suburbs for. And there they are in one of the early planned developments. To build his houses rapidly and inexpensively, Levitt used Henry Ford's method of the production line. Everything was broken down into separate steps. Teams of construction workers leveled the land, paved the streets, poured the concrete slabs, planted trees every 28 feet, and then installed plumbing and wiring. 100 houses were built at a time. Construction was clockwork. 8 a.m. trucks unloaded prefabricated siding. 9:30 a.m. the toilets arrived. 10 a.m. the sinks, tubs, and sheetrock. 11 a.m. the flooring. To speed construction and trim costs, painters used spray guns instead of brushes. The parts were pre-cut and fabricated at the factory instead of on-site. So it's actually manufactured housing. He cut costs to make them more affordable by eliminating basements and giving all the houses in its development the same floor plan. That is that same potato field, I believe, there, redone with all the housing. You can see it all in here. So there's this huge shift. In the 10 years between 1948 and 1958, 13 million homes were built in the U.S. 11 of them, 85%, were built in the suburbs. By 1960, there were as many people living in the suburbs as in central cities, and suburban way of life was changing American way of life. But not by the 1960 thing, as many people in suburbs as cities. How did suburban living change American society? Number one, it makes kind of shifts the American dream. Now owning a home becomes the American dream, and for the first time it is actually possible for a majority of Americans to do so. Americans start to have more space, and the way we live becomes spread out. Suburban sprawl, the idea that houses are spread out from each other, not dense living like in cities, becomes the norm. We've talked about this in our classes before, I think, where European cities tend to be much more densely populated, and Asian cities as well. Australia, Canada, and the U.S. are the kind of exception where we have these very spread out communities. Suburban life is very different from urban life. Urban life, you know your neighbors, you know the kids play in the street. Suburban life can be nice for the family, but it's much more private, but also a little bit more isolating. And some people saw suburban life as kind of sterile and monotonous. You get a lot of books and movies talking about alienation in the suburbs. For me, I think one of the nice things about a suburban life is it's a great place to grow up as a kid. And you have a lot of memories of playing with the neighborhood children. Another effect is it makes us very much a car-based society. You can't have suburbs without some form of transportation, and our sprawling suburbs really only work with when most people have a car, and so that makes us very much a car-based society. So that's going to segue into our next topic. The late 40s, the post-war era, is when the car really becomes a dominant product in American life. So this you should recognize that as being from the 20s or earlier. That's from the 30s, and that is, of course, a 50s style car. There's the 1957 Mercury, and there is a 50s era gas station, and kind of it didn't just, the adoption of the car didn't just boost the auto industry, it created whole new industries like service stations and the petroleum industry. What effect did the automobile have on American society? Number one, it made the suburbs possible. Number two, Americans have always been a mobile people. We move more than other societies do. If you think about back in the day, people, moving from the frontier. Lincoln, for example, his father was born in, I think, Virginia, and moved the family to Tennessee. Or Kentucky. Lincoln was born in Kentucky, then they moved to Indiana, then they moved to Illinois, and that's typical. But after the war, the car makes Americans even more mobile. It makes us mobile on a daily basis, so we can live in the suburbs and commute to work, and it makes us more mobile in life, so that we can take vacations, we can move around the country more. It's going to help produce the rise of the Sun Belt, I'll mention later in the lecture. The automobile changes social interaction. Again, it makes us able to go farther, different places, but it also kind of cuts down on neighbor-to-neighbor contact. So you can, live in the suburb, but then drive into work or drive to go socialize somewhere else. And so in some ways the car can also be isolating, just like the suburbs are. And the car is actually bad for American cities. The post-war period is when American cities actually reach their peak in the 50s and 60s, and then begin to decline as people move out of them, and then eventually companies move out of them as well, and we become much more a suburban-based society than a city-based one. That started to change just in the last 10, 15, 20 years, but for the most part cities have been hurting for about the last 60 years. The car also produces the rise of the Sun Belt. In the red are those southern and western states that saw a gain in population after the World War II. By population, in 1950, California was the size of Pennsylvania. Florida was 21st. Now, California is, of course, by far the most populous state, and Florida is 4th. One of the big developments of the second half of the 20th century was a shift in population from the older industrial cities of the Northeast and Midwest, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Indianapolis, Chicago, Cleveland, to the South and the West. For example, politically, since 1964, every elected U.S. president has been born or has claimed residence in the Sun Belt. Both the South and the West grew faster than the rest of the country since 1950. Some of that was due to government spending. Most of the military bases there are more in the South and in the West than in other parts of the country. That's all I'm going to say about the rise of the Sun Belt. Another kind of effect and cause of the rise of the car is the interstate highway system. In 1919, Eisenhower was in the Army, and it took him 62 days to travel over mostly unpaved roads from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. It took him 2 months to make the trip. Today you can make the trip in 72 hours. When he was president, Eisenhower authorized the largest public works project, the most government spending in the history of the world, and it was to build an interstate highway system. He had seen, when he was general during World War II, the Autobahns that Hitler had built in 1930s Germany, and thought that a national system of highways was necessary to move troops and military equipment if there was some type of war here, and for an evacuation route during national emergency. The interstate highway system ultimately cost about $130 billion to build. The federal government paid 90% of that. And you see a continuing trend where increasingly, since the New Deal, the things that the federal government does grow and grow. Now the federal government is building roads. The interstate highway system changed America's landscape. Instead of taking trains or buses, people began to commute by cars. The interstate highway system also helped with the suburbs to grow and more suburban sprawl. Shopping centers started to appear because people could drive to them, and that kind of, again, hurt the inner cities even more and smaller towns that were bypassed by the interstate. The way it worked was there was a series of freeways across the nation east-west that were labeled with even numbers. The 10 is the lowest, then there's Interstate 20, 30, 40, all the way up to Interstate 90, I-90, that goes from Seattle all the way to Maine, and of course passes right through Albany, I-90. If you're ever traveling west, don't take I-80. That one is flat and boring. You take I-90. And then the north-south routes are labeled with, they end in a 5. So I-5 is the westernmost, and I-95, you've probably traveled on that, goes all the way down to Florida. The fourth, and I think it's the final trend, is the baby boom. You've heard about the baby boom. You can see before the Depression, the birth rate was very high. You know, back in the early or turn of the century, most families had many, many babies, and then it began to decline. But after the World War II, there was a spike. Generally, as nations get wealthier and more advanced, the birth rate declines. So the baby boom was kind of an anomaly, an unusual thing. And it generally spans from about 1946 to 1963. What caused the baby boom? It's not the, kind of silly idea that soldiers had been away from their families and wives during World War II and came home and suddenly there were a lot of babies. It's more that during the Depression, people had held off on having big families because times were so difficult and uncertain, and there was a rush of both prosperity, and in this case people who had waited to have children kind of began to, and also the new kind of prosperity of the post-war era made people just more confident about starting big families. What effect did the baby boom have? It had a huge ripple effect through society, even up till today. So in the 50s and 60s, you had these very youthful communities. It obviously in the 50s and 60s led to a boom in selling products for children, toys and baby products. It led to a burst of school building. And then in the 70s and 80s, you had in the 60s you had kids becoming high school and college age, and that's going to affect everything that happens in the 60s as you have this youthful boom of people growing up and exerting a big influence, and that's why you get such a big youth movement in the late 60s and 70s. In the 80s and 90s, that same baby boom group is into the working age, and that affects the economy. And then now they're into their retirement age, and that's affecting us again as well. So when you look at the four things, can you answer the question, how was post-war life different from pre-war? Think back through affluence, the development of suburbs, the importance of the car, and the baby boom. And if you can put those four together, you have a very different post-war society than you did before World War II. There are more things to talk about with post-war American society, but those would be the big four. Thanks very much.